This is Trevin Edgeworth, and I lead the red team practice for Bishop Fox, specializing in all things related to adversary emulation. So this includes traditional red team, assume breach types of simulations, as well as purple team engagements to help blue teams to improve their ability to detect and respond to typical adversary behaviors. And we also perform tabletop simulations for both technical and executive audiences to help them strengthen their organizational response for different attacks. And we work with the complete range of customer environments that span a very broad range of different industries, levels of maturity. We see very traditional networks, we see very modern networks, and everything in between as well. But recently there have been a couple of cases highlighted where certain products that are pretty broadly used have known vulnerabilities that have gone unpatched for, in some cases, 6 or 7 different years. And in some cases, these are being leveraged by cyber criminals in actual attacks. And as I've read about these, I've thought about if I or my team came across one of these types of zero-day vulnerabilities within customer environments, what would that tell us about that environment that would possibly give us or actually a truly malicious attacker clues or hints about additional areas that could be fruitful to kind of look at or target your attack, whether that's an internal business process or possible technical arems where there might be additional things an attacker could leverage in their attack. So there's 2 in particular that come to mind, and we're going to talk about each of them one at a time. So the first of these is a memory corruption flaw in Microsoft Office that allows for remote code execution. Pretty significant one. Microsoft had released a patch for it. It's CVE 2017-11-882, way back in 2017. But here we are 6 years later, based on a number of different sources like Fortinet, Kaspersky, Trend Micro. It is found unpatched on a surprisingly high number of organizations. And it's being very actively exploited in the wild by cyber criminals in spear phishing attacks to deliver malware payloads through weaponized Excel attachments to targets. In fact, by 2018, this CVE had become one of the most targeted vulnerabilities in all of Microsoft Office. One campaign that's particularly active uses that vulnerability to deliver a remote access Trojan called Agent Tesla. So how is it that this is a 6-year-old vulnerability and a patch and so many organizations are missing it? I look at enterprise vulnerability management as sort of a pyramid with layers. At the base layer, you've got your operating systems, and enterprises can patch operating systems usually pretty well, Microsoft and non. And then the layer above that is common applications. So if you look at Microsoft Office or Adobe or Java or things like VMware, your enterprise applications, these are kinds of the things that you might find on your company's software portals. Where you might have some broad deployment of these types of applications within your user and server population, and they're more likely to be managed. And then you get to the layer where you have sort of more unmanaged, specialized custom applications that are less likely to be offered as an enterprise standard, but are still allowed. For example, they might allow alternative browsers or Spotify or note-taking applications and things not restricted. You're able to install them. These are very unlikely to be patched, and you're more reliant on the end users to keep these up to date. And a lot of organizations will focus their vulnerability patching efforts on their server systems as well, and rely on kind of limited admin access or user hardening, user workstation hardening to prevent kind of an overabundance of custom applications in there. But so as for what seeing this on red team engagement might tell a red teamer, for one, if it were pretty prevalent across user endpoint machines, it's a pretty strong sign that the organization isn't actually ready for a red team operation at that point in time. They may just not have that maturity level yet. And by extension of that, they're probably not ready for a real world attack of any kind of higher sophistication. So It's possibly a one-off that we've identified, but if it's thematic, then there are some 101 types of things the organization really should clean up while doing some other types of offensive security testing, like maybe pen testing or application pen testing and that type of a thing. So another thing this would tell a red team or an attacker is that there's likely weak user endpoint hardening overall, which could mean that mostly what's being patched or focused on from an IT perspective is just operating system and some managed applications. So sometimes that user endpoint can be deprioritized by IT departments. And so red teams and attackers can get away with a lot by staying within that space. But one thing that it tells me with actually a fair degree of certainty is that the organization is not using modern Office products like Office 365, and therefore they're not benefiting from a lot of the modern current security features and protections that are available, because with Office 365, generally you're getting updates auto-delivered on that. So as an attacker, how would I approach that differently? I would definitely pull on that 2017-11-882 thread, and I would use that try to use that for lateral movement. But even broader than that, I'd probably prioritize the user land as my path towards the trophies that I've got for my engagement, my attack targets. So maybe the user I compromised is lower privileged, but possibly a higher privileged user has that same missing patch, maybe a database admin or something like that. So I've already got a foothold, and that's how I was able to find out that vulnerability existed on one endpoint. But I could then, for example, try to leverage that foothold to put a similar malicious Excel payload into an open file share and try to lure a database admin to try to get that, or send an internal phish from an internal user, which would increase the likelihood that they're going to open it. So try to pull on that thread, but not necessarily, because there's probably some broader things that we've learned about that environment that, again, it's maybe not up to the same level of security standards as other parts of their network, and it's safe to kind of move laterally in that space there. So that's the one. And then the second vulnerability we wanted to talk about was a Java deserialization issue with Google Web Toolkit. If you're not familiar with Google Web Toolkit or GWT or GWT, it's a fairly popular open source application framework that was originally developed at Google. So like any application framework, it's going to host custom developed content, for example, a web application. But way back in 2015, there was open discussion around an unauthenticated deserialization vulnerability that could expose application owners to server-side code execution from unauthenticated attackers. I'm not going to go in depth as to the underpinnings of this. Ben Lincoln from Bishop Fox did a really strong write-up on this one. You can reference that for additional content here. But he provided a number of different potential workarounds. And in this case, there is no patch released for this. It still remains unpatched many years later. But there are workarounds, for example, modifying that web application that's been developed on top of GWT to not use specific classes where the vulnerability exists, or even to fork or modify GWT itself to add features like cryptographic signatures to serialize Java objects, or you could rewrite your applications to not run on GWT. Lastly, you could apply some sort of filtering logic on HTTP methods and URLs within those requests. But these are all pretty heavy lifts. They're going to be pretty substantial in terms of the level of effort. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that an organization that has this vulnerability is, for example, negligent or making some type of a rookie mistake. But an attacker is likely to uncover this one during some type of external enumeration. Once they've found a custom developed application exposed on the internet and they start poking at that web app, they may have identified this. And so what can they learn from this? What is it going to tell them? One thing is it's a potential indicator of poor vulnerability intelligence of the target organization, or possible security gaps in that vulnerability identification space, because it's entirely possible that the organization wasn't even aware that this vulnerability existed, or it wasn't detected through traditional vulnerability identification processes. That's certainly a possibility. Secondly, that organization is possibly over-reliant on applying software patches as the only solution or the main solution to fixing and remediating issues versus many other types of workarounds that may exist. So what may have happened is it did get identified, got sent to IT teams, they looked and said there's no patch available, so we're going to wait until a patch is available. And meanwhile, 5 years later, they're still waiting for that patch. And so meanwhile, there are things that could have been done to completely, partially or completely mitigate the risk there. Third, it's a possible sign of gaps, seams, silos when it comes to vulnerability remediation, possibly between the OS, the application, the development, CI/CD worlds, because it's very possible or likely that even when that vulnerability had been identified and sent to IT, they may have looked at that and again said, there's no patch, and then say there's nothing else that we can do about this, when in fact, the development teams that had content hosted by GWT possibly could have done some things around there. So each of these things can inform an attacker and help them to tailor attacks that will help them achieve their attack objective and evade detection. It's not just, after all, it's not just the blue teams that are risk averse or managing the risk. The attackers themselves as well are managing the risk of their own attacks, and they're going to choose the path of least resistance. And so these types of tea leaves that you can gain as you're on the network and you're constantly enumerating and learning about that environment help to craft the attack so that that risk is minimized, the risk of detection. So to summarize this, red teams, sophisticated attackers, they apply lessons learned throughout that attack chain, throughout the course of the attack to make sure that they maximize their chances of success. And your network gives up a lot of hints and signs as to how it can best be compromised, believe it or not. And one of those many sources of hints is the endpoint itself, and the existence of dated vulnerabilities. Unpatched vulnerabilities is going to be very useful information to an attacker, not just tactically, but also not just tactically in being able to exploit something to get from one link of the chain to the next in compromising your environment, but also strategically in determining the pathways that have the least amount of risks of being detected.